There's this lie we all tell ourselves. We're scrolling through our feeds, we see the absolute worst of humanity on the news, and we immediately think, man, I could never do that. Those people, they're monsters. It's comforting, right? It puts this nice, safe psychological wall between us and them. It makes us feel secure in our own identities. But what if I told you that wall doesn't exist? Today, we're going to tear down that illusion. Because the truth we're about to dive into, it is way more terrifying than any monster with fangs or claws.
Because when you actually look behind the closed doors of the Nuremberg Trials, the history books hit you with a deeply unsettling reality. The architects behind some of the worst atrocities in human history weren't these demonic, evil masterminds. They were shockingly, terrifyingly ordinary. I'm talking about guys who were just deeply insecure, opportunists, guys who worried about their families, who had mundane weekend hobbies, who dealt with crippling anxiety, stress, and just this desperate, all-consuming need for validation. Sound familiar?
So I want you to mentally step back in time with me for a second. It's 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. But this isn't a city anymore. It's practically a ghost town, just jagged rubble everywhere after 40 relentless air raids. And rolling through these completely destroyed streets is a heavy military convoy carrying the 52 surviving top Nazi leaders. The Allies brought them here for this totally unprecedented international trial. President Truman actually called it a public portrayal of guilt. The entire globe is watching, literally holding its breath, just waiting to see these mythological monsters unmasked. Section 1. The Myth of Monsters. The Search for the X Factor. You see, behind the scenes, the Allies were sweating. They had decisively won the physical war, sure, but they were absolutely terrified of losing the narrative war.
And honestly, they had every right to be afraid. Let's look at Hermann Göring, basically Hitler's chosen successor. This guy was a walking, breathing paradox. On one hand, he coldly orders the bombing of Rotterdam, killing thousands and displacing 100,000 more. But on the other hand, he loved animals so much he actually banned scientific testing on them. He secretly smuggled a Jewish nurse to safety because she treated him years ago. He obsessed over his wife and daughter. The Allies were terrified that a guy this charismatic, this complex, and, well, this human would use the trial as a viral platform, that he'd play the martyr and immortalize himself to millions of Germans who were still quietly worshiping him.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Nazi germ, Captain Douglas Kelley's mission. To stop this massive psychological disaster from happening, the U.S. Army brings in our lead detective for this explainer, Captain Douglas Kelley. Now, Kelley was an Army psychiatrist, and his initial job was just, keep the prisoners sane enough for trial. But Kelley took this routine gig and turned it into an obsessive, all-consuming quest to find the absolute root of human evil.
And Kelley was definitely not your average military doc. This guy was a childhood prodigy with an IQ of 135. He was an absolute adrenaline junkie, like he once drove completely blindfolded through his college campus just to see if he could. But here's the crazy part. He was also a highly trained magician who did Houdini-style escapes on stage. Kelley literally believed that magicians were the ultimate psychologists, masters of deception. So he figured, who better to sit across the table from the greatest deceivers in history and figure out their trick? Kelley was obsessed with this one desperate hypothesis. He kept wondering, is there a Nazi germ that infects an ordinary mind? He wanted so badly to find a biological defect, a literal glitch in their frontal lobes. Because think about it, if he could isolate that germ, he could basically extract the psychological vaccine against human evil. He could prove to the world, and honestly to himself, that these guys were fundamentally, biologically different from you and me.
But that whole grand illusion of the evil mastermind, it shattered the literal second he met them. When Göring was actually captured, he didn't look like some untouchable supervillain. No, he showed up weighing 120 kilograms, wearing these massive, gaudy emerald and ruby rings, lugging around 12 huge suitcases. And you know what was hidden inside? A crippling addiction. 20,000 narcotic pills. He was popping up to 100 strong painkillers every single day. He wasn't a mastermind. He was just a guy drowning in dopamine, desperately trying to mask his physical pain and his total psychological collapse.
Section 3. Third Reich, Inc. The Banality of the Boardroom. As Kelley sat down and interviewed the rest of these prisoners, his horror just started peaking. But not because they were scary. It was because they were so pathetically ordinary. We're talking bumbling racists, petty, jealous bureaucrats, massively insecure men hiding behind these tough, heroic battle scars that turned out to literally just be old car crash injuries.
And that's when it hit him. Kelley realized he wasn't looking at a Nazi germ. He was looking at a corporate org chart. The Third Reich basically operated almost exactly like a cutthroat modern startup. You've got Hitler sitting as the CEO, Göring is your high-level business planner, Ribbentrop, a guy who used to sell wine, is just the marketing guy pushing ideology instead of product. Göring even flat out admitted to Kelley in his cell that he only joined the Nazis because it was a small org with great career prospects. I mean, when Kelley asked him how he could coldly execute his own best friend Ernst Röhm, Göring didn't give some chilling villain monologue. He just shrugged and coldly replied, "He was in my way." It was literally just a horrific corporate restructuring, completely stripped of any human empathy.
Section 4, the final illusion, the trial as a stage. But Göring, of course, had one last trick up his sleeve. You see, Kelley, playing the good, empathetic doctor, actually managed to cure Göring of his massive chemical addiction. Göring dropped 27 kilos, the brain fog completely cleared, and with his absolute, pure narcissism fully restored, Göring decided he was going to turn this courtroom into his final, grand theatrical stage.
He put together this meticulous game plan. He rallied the other prisoners, telling them they were going to demand statues in every German home. He ordered them to completely refuse to apologize, to defend Hitler to the bitter end, and to die like unyielding soldiers so they'd be historically immortalized. He was commanding the room just like the old days. But that final illusion completely fell apart on November 29th. The prosecution dimmed the lights and played actual, visceral footage of the extermination camps right there in the room. Göring visibly collapsed in his seat. He hid his face. The heroic myth was dead. The court firmly denied his request for an honorable soldiers' firing squad, and instead they sentenced him to hang. Section 5. The Doctor's Descent, Becoming the Ghost. Now this is where our explainer takes a deeply tragic, incredibly cinematic twist. We've watched the monster fall, right? But what happens to the man who stares a little too long into the abyss?
The historical parallel here is absolutely devastating. See, Hermann Göring cheated the hangman. In his final hours, he swallowed a smuggled cyanide pill right in his cell, taking absolute control of his death in one ultimate act of narcissistic defiance. But years later, Douglas Kelley went back to America deeply traumatized. He realized anyone, anywhere, could be a Nazi, but the public totally rejected his warnings. They wanted to hear about monsters. They didn't want to look into a mirror. So Kelley spiraled. Severe, unrelenting alcoholism, terrifying sudden fits of domestic violence. He even turned his own 7-year-old son into an unwilling psychological lab rat, obsessively testing the boy's IQ, trying to make him immune to authority. The brilliant doctor had slowly morphed into the ghost of the monster he was studying. And on New Year's Eve in 1958, defeated, cornered, and standing right in front of his family, Douglas Kelley swallowed a cyanide pill, reenacting his rival's exact final act.
Section 6. The Banality of Evil. History's Impartial Warning. Kelley's tragic end is this profound psychological warning that society has actively tried to ignore for decades. It forces us to stop looking at the ruined, ashen streets of 1945 and look directly at the vulnerability of our own minds today.
And this brings us to the philosopher Hannah Arendt. She came up with a highly controversial concept during the 1961 Adolf Eichmann trial called the banality of evil. And people hated her for this idea. They called her terrible names. Why? Because she forcefully argued that the true, unspeakable horror of the Holocaust was that it was perpetrated by terrifyingly ordinary employees. People who were just doing their jobs. People just following the standard operating procedures so they could get a paycheck and go home to their families.
And if you think that sounds impossible, Stanley Milgram's famous electrical shock experiments proved her terrifyingly right. They took ordinary people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds, put them in a sterile lab, and had a guy in a white lab coat tell them to deliver electric shocks to a person in the next room for getting answers wrong. Even when they could clearly hear screams of intense agony, the vast majority of people cranked it all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. Why? Just because the authority figure said, "I take the responsibility, the experiment requires that you continue, just follow the orders." It turns out we are biologically hardwired for obedience, and that obedience is incredibly easy to weaponize.
As Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson warned the world right from the Nuremberg floor, let us never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. Look around today. Atrocities don't always require hidden barbed wire camps anymore. Sometimes they are literally live-streamed directly to our glowing screens, while millions of us just scroll by with a chilling sense of absolute impunity. The exact same psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to turn a blind eye, to justify the unjustifiable, or to crown new toxic narcissists as heroes, those mechanisms are perfectly intact in every single one of us.
Douglas Kelley died trying to warn us that there is no Nazi germ. There is zero biological difference between the monsters of history and the person staring back at you in the mirror every single morning. The capacity for profound cruelty and that deeply ingrained instinct to just unquestioningly obey is already sitting right there inside all of us. The only real defense mechanism we actually have against it is rigorous self-awareness. So I want to leave you with a question to chew on. If the architects of history's greatest evils were just ordinary people, navigating their own ambitions, their anxieties, and their insecurities, are you truly immune? Think about that.